right, thank you all very much for staying with us. For this next panel, we are taking a look at capitalism in a post-COVID world. We just heard Roger Cohen, my colleague, in conversation with Anand Girihardas, and one of the main takeaways from that discussion is the idea that companies and governments amid this COVID crisis are increasing their chokehold on power in a variety of ways. The COVID crisis obviously has shaken up how we view the world and how the world works. In particular, this crisis appears to be serving as a wake-up call for reforming capitalism in the different forms that it takes around the world. Shareholders are pressing businesses to take more responsibility as concerns about inequality, climate change, and populism grow. And at the same time, governments in the United States, Europe, China, and elsewhere are stepping forward with massive financial support for their economies, but raising at the same time questions about cost and competitiveness trade-offs, and of course, this issue of a growing chokehold on power. I'm Liz Alderman. I'm the Chief European Business Correspondent for the New York Times, and I'm really happy to be welcoming a distinguished panel today to discuss these issues that are confronting us. Beata Jaworczyk, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. You're the Chief Economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Thanks for joining us virtually. We've got Eric Lee as well joining us from China. You're a venture capitalist and a political scientist based in Shanghai. Valerie Keller, we're happy to have you here in person. You're the co-founder and CEO of Imagine. And Frederica Pierucci, you are currently an author, former senior executive at the French company Alstom, and currently a founding partner at Icarian. Let me start with, I want to ask all of you sort of this question, if I may, this opening question, and that is, will the coronavirus pandemic change capitalism as we know it? And to the extent that it's happening, how big of a change are we seeing? Beata, maybe I could toss that question to you to respond to first.
It's a pleasure to be part of this conversation. So I think that the pandemic will leave the world with a much greater public support for state ownership in the economy. Now, this is not a new trend. Public support for state ownership has been growing steadily over the last 2 decades. And that's a reflection of dissatisfaction with increasing inequality and dissatisfaction with the shifting of risk away from business onto the workers who are least able to bear those risks. So workers with little education, workers who get low incomes. And if you look at surveys, 1/3 of respondents in advanced countries support expansion of public ownership. And that's an increase of 6 percentage points over 20 years. Now, in post-communist countries, this figure is even larger. It's 45% of people who want to see expansion of public ownership. And that support is greater among lower income people, among women, among those currently employed in the public sector. Now, what the past pandemic teach us, or past recessions, is that people who came into adulthood during a recession are much more supportive of public ownership. People who have come into adulthood during epidemics also view public ownership more positively. So, and these numbers, these changes in people's preferences may be enough in some countries to actually sway the majority view. So what I would expect is that we are more likely to see state as part of the solution rather than a problem in the post-pandemic world. Thank you.
Eric, from where you're sitting in China, is that how would you describe how the situation has panned out there? Obviously, the pandemic started there, but yet China took swift action, and now the Chinese economy is rebounding. The state obviously played a major role in that. Describe to us, if you would, sort of that interaction. How is that changing capitalism, Chinese capitalism as we know it?
Well, thank you. First of all, let me say that I'm happy to report that things are going great here. We've been back to normal for a long time, since April and May, although albeit Q2 was somewhat slower than before. But when we began the summer, everything was going on full steam. I'm a venture capitalist. I've got a lot of companies. Virtually all of them have been going on full cylinders, all cylinders. So I've been busier than ever, traveling everywhere in the country. It's a big country. So I haven't been able to fly internationally, but it feels like I've been flying just as many kilometers domestically in the last few months. I've been flying internationally. So business is going great. We pretty much eliminated, I believe, the pandemic. That's the good news. But to answer your question, obviously, I don't live in a capitalist society. I live in a socialist country. So perhaps let me address the question as capitalism in the capitalist world, if you will. Capitalism is a loaded word, of course. Nobody knows what it means. But the short answer is to the question whether the pandemic is changing capitalism as we know it. My answer is it should, but it probably won't. Because capitalism in the capitalist societies around the world has gotten into a state where, I would call it political capitalism, or some people call it neoliberalism, which really means that capital or special interests that represent capital have captured the political system for their own good. And it's being ossified. Without drastic political reform, I don't think you can change capitalism for the better to solve problems like the pandemic. And the pandemic really has what has revealed is this great dysfunction in governance in many capitalist societies or liberal societies, if you will. And we're seeing a total degradation of governance, of state capacity to solve problems for the collective. And I think it's a political problem, not an economic problem. So it'll be very, very difficult to solve. To solve.
Let me turn, if I could, to our panelists who are actually physically here in the room with us. If I could turn to Frederic, a response to what Eric is saying. You were a former executive at Alstom. You actually recently came out with a book about a very unusual experience that you had in the United States when you were arrested for what you described as basically the actions that the United States was taking to try and to use law as an economic weapon. Anyway, the issue that Eric just raised is one that you yourself are dealing with. Tell us what your response is to that.
Yes, thank you first of all for inviting me. I think the issue with the COVID is that it comes as a situation at a point in time where we had already a big crisis before, a big economic war between China and the US. So it comes at a time where it's a perfect storm where basically we're going through a global leadership change in the world. And the COVID is just going to exacerbate what has been already planted before. And I think for capitalism to work, like for our democracy to work, you need three things. You need rules that everybody understands and obey. You need trust in those rules. And then you need to provide people with the hope that tomorrow is going to be better with this system and with any other systems. And in the past few years, I mean, each of those points have been changing. First of all, the rules are no longer obeyed by everybody. Everybody is trying to change the rules. We went from the post-World War II system with the World Bank Organization, with the United Nations, with the World Trade Organization, and so on. And as we see it, people try to change the rules and move from multilateralism to unilateralism. And that's going to be exacerbated by the COVID, obviously, because everybody is going to change the basic rules. And then people have lost trust as well in those rules, because those rules have been also changed, when we saw some issues with IPRs, when we saw issues with data protection, when we saw issues with use of the law as an economic weapon to destabilize countries or companies. So those basics, fundamentals have been changed. So therefore, we have lost the people in all this. We've lost the trust of the people, and this has been also exacerbated by the fact that the people who thought they were living for instance, in a democratic environment, realized that the state could no longer provide them with basic safety, health safety, and economic safety, and so on. So unfortunately, I think we're going to go into a world much more chaotic, but not because of the COVID. COVID is just going to accelerate what's been planted for some time.
Valerie, I see you nodding your head at that statement. I mean, Imagine your group, you work obviously sort of with CEOs who are trying to respond in a better way, I guess, to increased pressure that stakeholders are bringing for companies to act in a more responsible way. Tell us about, this issue of trust that is being brought up in this discussion. How can companies, especially at a time like this, get the trust of more people, also in an economic environment where, despite noble pledges that are being made, the economic reality is going to be very harsh. We're going to see rising unemployment, more social distress. Talk to us about those challenges and how you're navigating them.
Yeah, happy to. So if I also go back, Liz, to your question of saying, will COVID change capitalism? I would suggest to us that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. And by that, I mean it already has changed it. So if you look at essentially this fact that we are globally interconnected, we have realized that we can respond quickly to global challenges if and when we need to, but I think we've also realized that there's nobody driving Spaceship Earth, as Buckminster Fuller said as well. And so I think what we see is a realization that there is a concentration of political and economic power, and there is a question that says, okay, but is that working for all of us? And then how do we, as individual leaders or people who are in positions of power, operate within that reality? So if I give an example by that, I mean that even just looking at the New York Times, was it 2 weeks ago? The special edition that you did on essentially the commentary on the Milton Friedman essay. 50 years on. And essentially that was a bit of a mea culpa that says actually that didn't work. It didn't work in terms of really making sure that we had people who could find safe livelihoods and also within our planetary boundaries. And so if you look at then saying that was a seminal shift, I believe, that is ushering in a clarity that there's an awareness that capitalism as we knew it, this Friedman ideology hasn't provided for freedom for human beings. We're here talking about democracy and the ability to live a great life as humans and find meaningful work and be connected. So what I see and we have seen is there is an awareness and an agreement that it hasn't worked. That's the starting point for understanding that it's different. I think of another seminal moment, and the CEO of Walmart, one of the world's largest companies in the world, global. So standing there saying to the leadership of the world who was listening onto this on their ship that says, actually, the freedom and ideology and capitalism hasn't fully served us well, and that Walmart is shifting to a regenerative company. That is a mindset shift that will change how it does business and what it does business with. So where we come from this is saying, look, you can sit there and do what Anand often does, which is push on businesses as being bad and evil. Human beings are the system. We talk about we want systems change. It's some people who are in current positions of power. And the thing that I and we are seeing and imagine is that these CEOs are human beings who also see what time it is, who also understand that we were on a trajectory to 4 degrees, who see what's happening in terms of our biodiversity loss, that our species has been fundamentally killing off other species or somehow not solving and caring for that, and who understand that the world doesn't work if people aren't employed, don't have living wages, and don't feel safe and protected. So what we see is CEOs who are coming together as human beings who say, I care, and this is not okay, and not on my watch. And it's not everybody, but it's enough. And I think what we see is that when you act together across a value chain, as we're seeing CEOs coming together in food, We've seen it now in fashion. We're starting to see it in finance and in other sectors that says if I'm a CEO and I think that, okay, I can only do so much within my company's space, but if I pull together across a value chain, we can actually transform markets. We can lift the floor for others if and when we work with the regulators and the governments. So that's where you have human beings who are in positions of business leadership who show up and saying, okay, we need to do business in a different way that is long-term, multi-stakeholder, everything the New York Times was talking about, right? Social responsibility, yeah? But we can't do that by ourselves, and we have to work with the human beings who are in positions of power in the regulatory environment. So when we have CEOs coming together to say, how can we help the EU Green Deal not become a brown deal? That is, how do we work with the regulators to say, how do we create the right incentives for us to be able to do what we know we need to do to help transform, if that case, food and agriculture, in other cases, fashion. So I think it's already happening, and I think the other thing that isn't a done deal, and this is the part that really worries me, is, you know, Eric was saying here in China, it's back to normal. And I remember a CEO, and I shared this story with you before as well, a CEO, a woman who was in China, and she told me, she said, you know, Valerie, I am the future, because what's happening here is just as Eric said, you know, there's hope for you guys. It can be normalized as well with where you are. She said, I'm like anybody else. I understand that there's no planet B. I know that business has a social and environmental responsibility. I see the data that says ESG companies have actually outperformed by 66% others in this environmental crisis. She said, but if to be honest with you, when I see the smog coming back over Shanghai, I'm encouraged because I feel like we're back on track. And this notion that says, well, wait a minute, we can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. And this isn't going to be a trade-off between can we provide for jobs and livelihood, and can we actually take care of the environment and do the changes that we know we need to do. So I think that the shift has happened in terms of an awareness that the current system as it's been hasn't provided for all of us and our host environment. But I also think that the potential to potentially stay in this seeming paradox of, well, but the business of business needs to just provide for jobs and livelihood, and humans have to then be in that planet, isn't going to sustain us. So I would say that we're in a fragile moment, but I do believe that enough humans are waking up, and if you talk about the younger generation, they're already there. So early humans who are coming into this are saying, sorry, that doesn't work for us. And I think that's the other thing that was going to already, if you looked at the kind of video that was shown before this panel, those two women, they've got it. They are it. They're talking about the relationship between business and government and people and society, and they're just saying it doesn't work if it doesn't work for all of us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the big challenge going forward, though, is that those are important pledges that companies are making, but we're also in a global economic environment in which we're facing a huge challenge, and that is a significant decline in demand, a huge change in our social behavior that is going to shift entire industries and that won't necessarily allow companies that are making those kind of pledges to be able to stick to them. Beata, I wanted to come back to you on the role of governments, because we're seeing governments basically having to step in a huge way during this crisis to support societies, to also support businesses, coming forward with a huge amount of spending, and being present, having big government present in a way that has been almost unprecedented for a number of decades. Can you talk to us about, you know, how long would you expect that dynamic to last? And also, you know, how we're also in a number of analyses out there say that we're also creating basically zombie companies with all of this support. So can you talk to us about basically how you see that unfolding?
An excellent question, Liz. So as you have said, we've seen governments protecting jobs. And it's a good idea to protect jobs for 3 months, but protecting jobs for 3 years is not sustainable. So what we need to do is to focus on protecting workers, not protecting jobs. We don't want to freeze the economy as it was in February, because the world has changed. We have changed the way we consume services. We've changed the way we consume entertainment. We've changed the way we shop. So what we need to do is allow restructuring of economy taking place, and in particular, restructuring with an eye on green transformation. At the EBRD, we've just run a survey with the German IFO Institute, and we found that as a result of the pandemic, many people have increased their awareness of climate change problems. And the numbers reported in the survey are mind-blowing. 50% of people in Turkey said now climate change is a big deal for them personally as a result of seeing the pandemic. It's more than 40% of people in Egypt or Greece and 20% of people in Belarus. So this crisis is also an opportunity to do something on climate change. And as Valerie said, there has been a shift in awareness, but there is a collective action problem, right? Dealing with climate change costs money. And during the times of economic hardship, it's not easy for firms to embark on such a transformation. And that's why, I think the key phrase in Valerie's message was firms need to work with governments. Firms need to work with governments on the best way of using regulation to stimulate climate change. And, they should do it not because they are nice, but because it's in their interest, because there is a silent backlash building up against capitalism, against private ownership. And it can be in the interest of large firms. When you talk to firms in emerging markets, they often say, well, we are already doing many right things because we are under pressure from our customers in Western countries, in advanced countries. But SMEs, the smaller players, are not. So many large firms actually would like regulation to level the playing field, again, to have the same rules for themselves and smaller players. So more cooperation on the regulatory front is what I would suggest. Thank you.
Yeah.
And Eric, from where you sit, how feasible is all of that sound to you?
Well, look, this morning I was reading Wednesday's New York Times. I get the paper a day late here in Shanghai. And on the front page, there's this big story and a very big picture, very sad picture, showing that the fashion industry in capitalist societies have destroyed India's rivers. Okay, and all the communities around those rivers, their lives and livelihoods destroyed because of the fashion industry in capitalist societies. They're so demanding. The dyes, moved into river. The rivers that used to be pristine 10, 20 years ago are now uninhabitable. And it really, it's very, very sad story. I'm very supportive of what Valerie is saying, but I just don't think it's going to work. This corporate social responsibility idea, we've had that for a long time. We've been talking about that for 25 years. I remember back in the days when business school, we were talking about it, 20, 25, 30 years ago. If it works, it should have worked. Okay, it doesn't work. Businesses are not built this way. I'm not a fan of Milton Friedman, but I'm afraid he was right in his technical analysis that companies are built to deliver profits to their owners. Unless you're telling me that you're going to appoint people who represent communities' interests or other interests onto the boards of those companies, I just don't think it's going to work. It hasn't worked for 25 years. All the arguments I hear today, I used to hear them when I was a very, very young man in business school. Okay, everything, a repeat. And look at, tell that to the people who live on those rivers in India. Okay, 2 generations have passed. So my answer is, I just don't think the answer is in the hands of CEOs. the answer is in the hands of political leaders. But those political leaders in capitalist societies are in the pockets of special interests. So without drastic political reforms, without drastic institutional reforms, without changing the entire systems, I just don't think you could reform capitalism.
That's a really important point that you're making. I do want to give Valerie in a moment a chance to respond, but before I do, Frédéric, what is your view? I mean, you are somebody who, a former chief executive of one of the world's biggest companies, who yourself have also worked with governments. What is your view of what Eric just said?
I agree with Eric that companies are not going to change because they are not built as such. I think only government can impose things to companies and people. And I think Valerie, you're right. This is going to be coming from the young generation because those young kids, and this young generation, they are built in a completely different way. We've seen during the COVID crisis that a lot of countries are too dependent on low-cost, just-in-time deliveries of goods. So there's a big shift now towards reindustrialization of some countries, at least on strategic product. This in itself is going to stop some of the crazy flows between countries that, importing oranges from all over the world, to Europe, it doesn't make any sense. So, and also some of the strategic products. So I think the pressure is going to come more from the street that people will want to feel safe at home. They will want to make sure that they have a mask, that they have a hospital warning, that they will want to make sure that they keep their job. And in order to keep their job, they will want to make sure that they can manufacture the goods at home and so on. So I think we're going to see this shift, and we already see this shift. A lot of countries are saying, okay, I don't need so many trade agreements with so many countries. I can do it on my own. This trend, I think, started some time ago, and this is exacerbated again by the economic war, because if you look at the economic war between China and the US with the European in the middle, you see a lot of countries saying, I'm going to put a wall around me, Look at the internet. It's going to be probably broken up into 2 or 3 internets because nobody wants their data to be shifted right and left. Nobody wants to be spied right and left and so on. So we're going to see this move. This move is going to, at the end of the day, it's going to be a new kind of capitalism. It's not going to be sovereign. It's going to be a new kind of capitalism that we need to build. But I think the good thing about this new world is going to be for the environmental. It's not going to come from the top. It's going to come from the street. That people will want to buy locally, will want to basically use the local economy and develop their local economy.
Mm-hmm. Valerie, over you, and we have a question coming in that basically plays off of what the both of you just said. A viewer is asking, can social ills be corrected under a capitalist system that focuses on profit?
So, look, I'm not a naive, I'm a pragmatist, actually. So I don't disagree with what Eric is saying. I mean, 25 years, I've grown up in that too. I'm 44 years old. That means half my life has been in the kind of like, oh, we're in this move too, right? Yes, the rivers have been polluted. We're on a trajectory to have more plastic in the oceans than fish. The Aral Sea, which was the 4th largest sea when I was born into the world in 1976, is now a carcinogenic desert floor bed with camels walking on it. Why? Not because of any kind of horrible ill will, but because the water was diverted by the Soviets for cotton production, for textile production, for clothing and fashion. So here you have this loss of wages, all the diseases, all of that. It was just unintended. Why? Because people were acting unconsciously. They weren't saying, oh, we had Rana Plaza, that was another failure. Why didn't that wake us up? So when we say, is business now there to clean up the act of the mess that it caused? There is a bit of that, that's yes. If I then say, okay, but business isn't going to do it, so therefore we need more political power, who in this conversation really sees the trajectory to be able to change the laws in the time frame that we need to bend the curve? I don't see it. And so because we haven't seen it, we can't rely on the government the business community. It's who is in power today. And the fact that we have concentration of hands in the power of big global corporations, there are human beings who are global, who are starting to take responsibility for their supply chain to say, okay, not on my watch. It's not okay that somebody dies in a plaza or doesn't get a living wage and a child is going hungry on that. It's not okay that the rivers in Indonesia for textile productions are purple when we have the money, we have the innovation, we have the technology and know-how. So I started in the social sector space. I was running homeless shelters at one point, had the option to go into government and said, okay, but where's the energy of how things can move quickly in this system? And if we've made up, as we're going to hear a bit from, I think Yuval Harari is here, with Sapiens, humans made up this notion of money. It was this thing for trust between us. But if we have made the search for money become the dominant thing that we're all living this life experience for, that's not going to be something that is able to then sustain us as we go. I think there is a consciousness shift and an awareness, and I'm not saying that business is the answer. I'm saying that human beings who say it's not okay that we are actually connected to each other and we are actually connected to our nature and to our natural environment, and it doesn't work the way that it's been working. And because those people are in a position to tomorrow change their business behavior, if their mindset shifts, I have hope. Because they are coming together, and this isn't theory, this is practice. This is within 3 weeks of being able to put out a call, we asked 27 CEOs across the full food value chain, and they showed up as fathers and mothers and as human beings who care. And that is the part that gives me hope. And then when they say, you know what, we do need a new regulatory standard, we're asking the political regulation to help incentivize us to do the things that we know we need to do. If we know we can sequester carbon in the soil, but how do we help create the enabling environment that does that? And then how can we connect into regulators and provide safe space? I'm not saying it has all the answers, but I will tell you, Liz, and the rest of you, it is the thing that is giving me hope. Because we are seeing also the same thing, a private equity company that is saying, oh, wait, we need to transform capital to be a force for good. This has been unsustainable. My children are all turning vegan and vegetarian on me. Why? Not because it's trendy and cool, but because they say they know the impact of animal agriculture on deforestation and on our environment. And so we need to help transform capital to be a force for good. And what does that mean for us? And so we see leaders waking up. And I'm not saying it is the answer, but I am saying that we can't sit here and admire the problem and say it's up to them. Is it government or is it up to business? We are the ones that we've been waiting for. And if we don't start showing up as human beings who say we need to be working together to say how do we create the environment that provides for long-term, multi-stakeholder, unless we're going to move into the kind of environment that Eric is in and become a socialist economies. But if we're not, then I would suggest to us that we've got to figure out this conscious capitalism, multi-stakeholder, firms that are providing for the well-being and care of others. And I would also suggest to us that the conversations that we are having with business leaders is that people are there. They know this works, that it isn't a normal paradox and trade-off anymore. Then, so I'm not saying everybody is. Well, what I am saying is that enough people have
put it back into, if we could put all of what you're saying back into the current context and the even greater challenges that we're facing, though, in a COVID world and a post-COVID world. The word that was brought up earlier during this conversation, trust. There are still a lot of people out there who don't necessarily trust the pledges that you're talking about that CEOs are making, because they don't see that companies are necessarily putting their money where their mouth is. When you have a lot of corporations that are going to be laying off tens of thousands of people during this crisis, despite receiving government support, people are concerned about the environment, but they're more concerned about putting food in their mouths and being able to provide for their families without having to live off of government support for the foreseeable future. And we have, a person who's written in has made a comment, no matter if there is neoliberal capitalism or state capitalism, hedge funds, and just generally speaking, those with power and those with money are growing in parallel and creating even greater inequalities in our societies, and protests are emerging.
It's unsustainable. The current trajectory is unsustainable.
So if we only have 3 minutes left, but if I could, I would just love for all of you to very quickly, if you could, just give a Twitter response to this question. Given everything that we're seeing, everything that's been discussed during this panel, what would you say we have learned so far about the trade-off between this dilemma that the world is facing, keeping our economies open to avoid further economic catastrophe, and the imperative to protect health. And, you know, how are both governments and companies going to deal with this moving forward? Frederick?
I think the big challenge is going to come to stop the economic war. Again, I'm coming back to this because as long as you have economic war, you know, companies are not going to cut themselves in order to for the good of the world. You know, if you know that your competitor is not going to do the same thing. Oh. So, and if you are going to talk about ESG norms, okay, maybe, but if people believe, again, I come to the same thing, if people believe in the rules that are being laid out, yes. If people believe that nobody's going to cheat, yes. But right now, if you don't have the trust, and right now we are not in the moment where trust is there between big nations. So if you don't have the trust, you need something else to make it work. It's not going to come from the top again, I think, because there's no trust at the top. So what could have been a good solution is if we made peace right now, stop the economic war, and work together, especially China and US, and of course Europe in the middle. But right now it's not going to happen. Yeah. And it's not going to happen for many, many reasons. So the only way for me this is going to change the paradigm is if people are really imposing this on everybody. On everybody. People demand short supply chain. People demand local product manufactured in a socially, environmentally nice way, and so on. This is going to make change the world. I think coming from the top right now, I'm not very optimistic on that stage.
Great, very good. Well, I wish we actually had more time to talk about this. I was hoping that all of you could answer the question, but thank you very much for joining us, and this is clearly a discussion that needs to continue in the future. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
We really appreciate it, and please stick around for the next panel.